So welcome back. We were looking at the beginnings of modern sport in the 19th century and colonial Australia. So we've looked at the first 2 points in the previous videos. We looked at the links with manliness, patriotism and character. We also looked at the meaning of amateur and professional sport. This video, we're going to look at women's historical participation in sport. So during the 19th century, sport was predominantly a male domain. Women weren't accepted to play sport, and they weren't definitely not considered that they should be playing sport. The concept of manliness didn't also help women become involved in sport, and that was also explained in that couple of videos ago in regards to manliness in sport. Sport was always about strength, power and mateship, and you had to have those characteristics if you were to play sport, and if you didn't have those characteristics, sport will develop those into you. And especially that's what, why sport was quite predominantly in high and upper class schools, because that brings the loyalty, that brings the manship, that brings the mateship, that brings the culture, and that's all what sport brought. So women was considered as feminine, dainty, graceful, and so the sporting arena was no place for women. So women was considered as dainty. The other myths that was involved was, females' reproductive system should not be put into a domain of physical sport where it could harm them from having future babies. It was basically females were considered fragile, so therefore contact sport will hurt them. Females weren't considered to be strong or athletic. So therefore no one would want to see a female on a sporting field because it'd be very unattractive. And females was considered to be, their only role was to look after the man, to ensure that the man was feeling good basically when he came home, in regards to after a long day at work, that the meals prepared. Females were considered as the ones who would look after the children, would also be the cooks of the family. It's all that old traditional, old-fashioned rules, you could say. However, if you were a woman in the upper class, you were at least allowed to participate in a lot of recreational sports, such as sailing, archery, croquet, shooting, horse riding. And then the changes to work and living conditions saw that women participate in swimming. The upper class were starting to build houses closer to the shore, and so therefore it was close to the ocean. They had their pools, so it was basically swimming started to become a pastime for them as well. And Australia's first gold medalist, Fanny Durack, she won gold at the 1912 Olympics for swimming. So the sports that were popular for females were sports that they could have easy accessible to. So tennis, a lot of residential areas had their own tennis courts. Golf was another one, because a lot of the golf was seen a lot dainty, a lot more feminine than, say, rugby league, rugby union, AFL, football, where there was contact sports, and and croquet was another one. So at the turn of the century, more women got more involved in sport. And we saw that a lot more sports became a lot more accessible to women and a lot more acceptable. Their clothes started to change as well. So if you were a cyclist, you were allowed to wear bloomers instead of those long dresses that women had to wear back then. Keeping in mind that the acceptable dress for women back then too, sort of avoided them from participating in a lot of sports. So as we could see, as time went by, a lot more women were quietly involved in sport. And now what we see these days is we see that women are involved in rugby league, in AFL, in football. There's actually quite highly skillful athletes that play these sports, such as cricket. We see various sports around the world that women participate, and they're actually quite athletic too. And we see that it's basically the change in the mentality of society. And we go by what society's norms are. And the norms these days is women are as much acceptable to play any sport as males do too. So thanks for watching this video. Now you would have seen 3 videos for the first topic area of sports and physical activity in Australia, which is the beginnings of modern sport in the 19th century England and colonial Australia. So if you haven't seen the other videos, the other ones obviously were about the links to manliness, patriotism and character. The second video was on the meanings of amateur and professional sport, and you've just watched about women's historical participation in sport. So now that we've finished the first syllabus area, you'll be able to compare now both how amateur sport in the 19th century has changed to more professional type of sport. You'll be able to compare the sports of the 19th century to the sports that is now, and take into consideration the questions of how has amateur sport changed into a more of a professionalism. And you can take into consideration the questions such as how has amateur and professional sports changed over time? How has the meaning of sport differ across different social groups? And how did women and men's sport participate in sport differently, and why? So by looking at those questions, you'll be able to satisfy any question that might come up in the HSC exam that's relevant to that.